waters of the Baltic Sea, empires clashed and kingdoms crumbled, driven by an insatiable hunger for power and dominance. This was no ordinary war. It was a crucible that would forge new powers and shatter old ones, altering the balance of European power forever. This was the Great Northern War, a conflict that pitted ambition against tradition, youth against experience, and strategy against sheer willpower. It wasn't merely a battle for land. It was a battle for the future of Europe. At the heart of this turbulent saga stood Sweden, a kingdom that had risen to near mythic heights during the 17th century. By the dawn of the 18th century, Sweden's navy ruled the Baltic, and its territories stretched like a crown around the sea's icy edges. Under the leadership of warrior kings like Gustavus Adolphus and Charles XI, Sweden had not only secured military dominance, but had also embedded itself as a formidable player in the European theatre. To its neighbours, Sweden wasn't just a country, it was a colossus, casting long shadows over Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, and the rising Russian Tsardom. But shadows often provoke rebellion. In the early 1700s, a new generation of rulers sought to dismantle Sweden's dominance. Russia, under the youthful and visionary Peter the Great, was no longer content to be Europe's backwater. Peter had dreams of modernising his country and carving out a maritime empire with the Baltic as its lifeblood. To the west, Denmark-Norway saw an opportunity to reclaim lost lands and prestige, while Augustus II of Saxony-Poland, known for his unrelenting ambition, sought to restore his fractured kingdom to greatness. These challengers shared one belief: the time of Sweden's supremacy had passed, and they would be the architects of its demise. The Great Northern War wasn't just another chapter in the annals of history, it was a seismic event. It marked the end of Sweden's era as a European superpower, a golden age that had dazzled the continent for nearly a century. In its place, a new titan emerged from the ashes: Russia. As historian Robert Frost succinctly captured it, the war marked the twilight of Sweden's empire and the dawn of Russia's dominance. But this story is more than a tale of power shifts. It is a saga of human ambition, courage, and resilience. It is the story of Peter the Great, a Tsar who dreamed of building a navy from scratch and transforming a kingdom of forests into an empire of cities. It is the story of Charles XII, the young Swedish king who would become both a hero and a tragic figure in the theatre of war. It is the story of alliances forged and broken, of sieges that tested the mettle of armies, and of battles that would echo across the centuries. Before we delve into the labyrinth of sieges, naval battles, and diplomatic intrigues, I'd like to take a moment to welcome you to ASMR History. Here, we dive deep into the past, unravelling the threads of history with meticulous care and a touch of serenity. Together, we'll explore the monumental events and fascinating lives that shaped our world, one whispered story at a time. If you're as captivated by the human drama of history as I am, then you're in the right place. Let's journey back to the age of empire and ambition, now to must first step back and examine the stage upon which it was set. The Baltic region, a critical nexus of trade and military power, was the prize over which kingdoms would shed rivers of blood. Sweden's dominance had made it both a power and a target, but the geopolitical landscape was far from simple. To unravel the causes of this epic conflict, we must explore the simmering tensions, the shifting alliances, and the competing ambitions that turned the Baltic into a battleground. By the close of the 17th century, Europe was a chessboard of empires, principalities, and rising powers, each manoeuvring to secure their place in an ever-shifting balance of dominance. Amid this intricate game, the Baltic Sea stood as one of the most coveted prizes. Not merely a body of water, the Baltic was a gateway, a corridor through which the veins of European commerce pulsed. Ships laden with timber, iron, grain, and furs traversed its icy waters, feeding the economies of nations from the Netherlands to Russia. It was said, whoever controls the Baltic controls the lifeblood of Europe's commerce. Sweden had learned this lesson well. Emerging victorious from the 30 Years' War in 1648, Sweden had transformed itself from a modest kingdom on Europe's fringe to an empire that dominated the Baltic. The Treaty of Westphalia handed Sweden key territories: Pomerania, Bremen-Verden, and Wismar in the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the islands of Ossel and Dago. These acquisitions granted Sweden control of crucial trading ports and shipping lanes, allowing it to act as both a toll keeper and a military juggernaut in the region. The Baltic was no longer just a sea, it was a Swedish lake. This dominance didn't go unnoticed. To the east, Russia simmered with ambition. For centuries, the Tsardom had been landlocked, unable to expand its influence beyond its sprawling forests and steppes. Peter the Great, Russia's young and reformist ruler, envisioned a nation transformed, one that would look westward toward European trade and culture. To achieve this dream, Peter needed a fleet and access to the sea. The Baltic was his key, and Sweden was the lock. To Sweden's southwest, Denmark-Norway, led by Frederick IV, also watched the Baltic with hungry eyes. Denmark had long sought to regain control of the Øresund Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Baltic to the North Sea. Though Sweden had humbled Denmark in earlier conflicts, Frederick believed the time was ripe for revenge. With allies in Russia and Saxony-Poland, Denmark hoped to tip the balance of power in its favour. Yet, for all its power, Sweden's dominance came with vulnerabilities. Its territories were vast but scattered, a patchwork quilt of lands stitched together by waterways and vulnerable borders. This strategic overextension meant that Sweden's navy and army, formidable though they were, had to defend a sprawling and often disconnected empire. While Sweden enjoyed temporary peace at the dawn of the 18th century, the ambitions of its neighbours loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. The Baltic itself was a battleground, not just of militaries, but of economies. Sweden's control over critical ports and trade routes allowed it to impose tariffs and tolls, filling its coffers at the expense of its rivals. This economic stranglehold inflamed tensions with trading powers like the Dutch Republic and England, who relied on the steady flow of goods from the Baltic. The region's wealth in timber, used for shipbuilding, and iron, essential for weapons, made it a critical resource hub for any aspiring empire. To dominate the Baltic was to command not only the sea, but also the machinery of war. For Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Saxony, Poland, the stakes could not have been higher. Peter the Great's modernisation efforts demanded resources, and the Baltic's wealth was too enticing to ignore. Denmark sought to reclaim its status as a regional power, while Augustus II of Saxony-Poland viewed the conflict as a means to consolidate his fractured realm. Each saw Sweden's supremacy as an obstacle to their ambitions, and an opportunity if that supremacy could be shattered. But power is rarely ceded without a fight. Sweden, despite its vulnerabilities, was led by a warrior king in every sense of the word. Charles XII, crowned at the tender age of 15, would soon face the full force of these rival ambitions. Brilliant, bold, and unyielding, Charles was a leader whose strategies and battlefield heroics would shape the course of the Great Northern War and leave an indelible mark on history. It was through his vision, and perhaps his hubris, that Sweden would stand defiant against the rising tide of enemies that sought to unmake its empire. It is rare for history to produce a figure so brilliant, so bold, and so polarising as Charles XII of Sweden, born on June 17th, 1682, to King Charles XI and Queen Ulrika Eleonora. Charles seemed destined for greatness, or perhaps for tragedy. From the moment he ascended to the throne in 1697, at just 15 years old, it was clear that Sweden's young king was unlike any other. The coronation was marked by the abolition of the regency, a bold move orchestrated by Charles himself. This teenager had no interest in being guided or restrained by older statesmen. He would be his own man, his own king. Charles's youth was shaped by the stern discipline of his father, a meticulous ruler who built Sweden's military into a finely tuned machine. Unlike many royal heirs of his time, Charles was not coddled. His education was rigorous, with a heavy emphasis on languages, mathematics, and, most importantly, warfare. Tutors drilled him in the art of strategy, the mechanics of weaponry, and the histories of great military leaders. Charles absorbed it all with a fervent intensity. By the time he became king, he was already a skilled horseman, an accomplished marksman, and a student of battle. He embodied Sweden's martial tradition, a legacy forged in the fires of the 30 Years' War. Yet Charles was more than a product of his upbringing. He was a man of striking contrasts. To his soldiers he was an inspiring figure, leading from the front with unflinching bravery. To his enemies he was a force of nature, a relentless commander whose strategies were as daring as they were devastating. His contemporaries described him as stoic, almost unnervingly so. He rarely laughed and seemed immune to the pleasures of court life. A Spartan king in an age of decadence, Charles shunned luxury, devoting himself entirely to his cause, the preservation Charles's reign were defined by a baptism of fire. Barely 2 years after his coronation, Sweden faced a coalition of enemies determined to bring it to its knees. Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Saxony, Poland had joined forces, believing that the young king would crumble under pressure. They underestimated him at their peril. In 1700, Charles launched his legendary counterattack, landing in Denmark and forcing Frederick IV to sue for peace within weeks. From there, he turned his attention to Russia, delivering a crushing defeat to Peter the Great at the Battle of Narva. Charles's audacity and tactical brilliance left Europe in awe. At just 18 years old, he had already reshaped the continent's political landscape. But Charles's strengths were also his greatest weaknesses. His refusal to compromise, his disdain for diplomacy, and his single-minded pursuit of victory often led him into dangerous waters. His campaigns grew increasingly ambitious and increasingly costly. While his victories earned him the moniker of a military genius, his detractors viewed him as an overreaching monarch whose relentless wars drained Sweden's resources and strained its people. A king is never retreating. He is advancing to the rear, Charles famously quipped, a line that captured both his determination and his unyielding belief in his own invincibility. One of the most defining moments of Charles's career came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. After years of successful campaigns, the Swedish king gambled everything on a march deep into Russian territory. Exhausted, undersupplied, and outnumbered, his army was met by Peter the Great's revitalized forces. It was a catastrophic defeat, one from which Sweden would never fully recover. Yet even in retreat, Charles remained undeterred. He fled to the Ottoman Empire, plotting his next move with the same unwavering resolve that had defined his reign. To his admirers, Charles XII was a hero of almost mythical proportions, a man who refused to bend no matter the odds. To his critics, he was a tragic figure, a king whose brilliance was overshadowed by his hubris. Either way, his story is one of unparalleled drama and complexity. He was the last great warrior king of Sweden, a ruler who lived and died by the sword. As we examine the rise of Charles XII, we must also consider the forces that aligned against him. His enemies did not act alone. Their coordination was deliberate, calculated, and aimed at dismantling the Swedish Empire piece by piece. This alliance, forged in the fires of mutual ambition and fear, would come to be known as the Triple Alliance, a coalition that would test Charles's mettle and forever alter the course of the Great Northern War. The might of Sweden, forged over decades of war and diplomacy, was a thorn in the side of Europe's other Baltic powers. For too long, its dominance had suffocated their ambitions. By the late 17th century, Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, and Russia found themselves sharing a common grievance: Sweden's iron grip on the Baltic region. Together, they resolved to dismantle its empire, but such an audacious goal required unity. Through secretive negotiations and a shared sense of purpose, these three powers forged the Triple Alliance, a and redraw the map of Northern Europe. Each member of the alliance brought his own motivations and frustrations to the table. For Denmark-Norway, revenge simmered just beneath the surface. Decades earlier, Sweden had humiliated Denmark, stripping it of key territories like Scania and Bohuslän. King Frederick IV, determined to reclaim his nation's lost glory, saw the alliance as the perfect vehicle for redemption. The Øresund Strait, a critical maritime choke point, was Denmark's lifeline to the wider world, and Sweden's presence on both sides of the strait posed a constant threat to Danish trade and security. Saxony-Poland, under the leadership of Augustus II, had its own axe to grind. Augustus, a man of towering ambition and restless energy, had inherited a fragmented Polish-Lithuanian commonwealth. He viewed the war against Sweden not only as a means to restore Poland's fractured authority, but also as an opportunity to elevate his own legacy. The prospect of reclaiming Livonia, a wealthy province long under Swedish control, was particularly enticing. Augustus famously wrote to Peter the Great, "Our combined strength will undo Sweden's stranglehold." For Russia, the alliance was nothing short of transformative. Peter the Great, the visionary Tsar, understood that his empire's future depended on access to the sea. Locked away from the world's great trade routes, Russia's economy and culture lagged behind its Western counterparts. The Baltic Sea was the key to Peter's dream of a modern, maritime Russia. But Sweden's dominance made that dream impossible. Joining forces with Denmark, Norway, and Saxony-Poland gave Peter the allies he needed to challenge the might of Charles XII. Negotiations for the alliance were a delicate dance, fraught with suspicion and conflicting interests. Though they shared a common enemy, the three powers were wary of each other's ambitions. Diplomats from all sides exchanged letters, convened secret meetings, and brokered deals to ensure their mutual objectives aligned. The Treaty of Preobrazhenskoye, signed in 1699, formalized their union. It outlined a coordinated strategy. Denmark-Norway would strike first, targeting Sweden's allies in Holstein-Gottorp, while Augustus II would invade Livonia. Peter the Great, meanwhile, would prepare to launch an assault on Swedish territories in the east. Despite their careful planning, the alliance was not without its flaws. Trust among the three powers was tenuous at best. Denmark worried about Russia's growing influence in the Baltic, while Augustus feared that Peter's ambitions might eclipse his own. Even so, their shared hatred of Swedish dominance was enough to bind them together. The alliance was a fragile but powerful machine, primed to dismantle Sweden's empire. At the heart of their strategy was a bold vision: break Sweden's stranglehold on the Baltic and redistribute its spoils among themselves. The Baltic's ports and trade routes represented unimaginable wealth, and controlling them would tip the balance of power in their favour. For Denmark, it meant dominance over the Øresund. For Augustus, it promised the restoration of Poland's pride. For Peter, it was the gateway to Russia's transformation. The Triple Alliance was not just a coalition of nations, It was a declaration of intent. It sent a clear message to Charles XII and his court. Sweden's golden age was over, but, as they would soon learn, Charles was no ordinary monarch. He was a warrior king who thrived on adversity, and Sweden was a nation built for war. The Alliance may have believed they had the upper hand, but Charles was about to teach them the cost of underestimating him. As these three powers prepared their opening moves, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic conflicts in European history. The first salvo was about to be fired, and the Great Northern War would begin with an eruption of violence that would echo across the Baltic. The year 1700 erupted with the opening shots of a war that would consume Northern Europe for over 2 decades. The Triple Alliance, convinced that their moment had come, launched coordinated strikes to dismantle Sweden's Baltic Empire. It was a bold, calculated gamble, but one they believed Sweden's young king could not withstand. They had underestimated Charles XII and the unyielding discipline of his army. Denmark moved first, aiming its fury at Holstein-Gottorp, a small duchy allied with Sweden. The Danes sought to eliminate this strategic partner, hoping to sever Sweden's western support. King Frederick IV's forces invaded with confidence, believing they could crush the duchy quickly. But Holstein-Gottorp, though small, was fortified and fiercely loyal to its Swedish ally. The invasion dragged on, bogged down by stubborn resistance and logistical challenges. Meanwhile, Saxony-Poland opened a second front, with Augustus II directing his armies into Livonia. This rich and fertile region, under Swedish control for decades, was a glittering prize Augustus was determined to claim. To the east, Peter the Great struck with Russian forces at Narva, a key Swedish fortress in Estonia. The Russians, numbering over 35,000, laid siege to the city, confident that their overwhelming numbers would break through its defences. For Peter, this was more than just a battle. It was a declaration that Russia had arrived on the European stage. The Tsar's forces encircled Narva, expecting swift victory. It was a perfect storm of aggression, with Sweden seemingly surrounded on all sides. But Charles XII, then only 18 years old, did not flinch. As Karl Piper, one of Charles's most trusted ministers, reportedly said, "The lion does not cower when the jackals encircle." Charles embodied this spirit, rallying his nation and preparing for a counter-strike that would stun his enemies and cement his reputation as a warrior king. Sweden's army, though outnumbered and spread thin, was a marvel of discipline and efficiency. Years of rigorous training had honed its soldiers into one of Europe's finest fighting forces. Unlike the armies of his adversary, Serge, Charles's troops were professional soldiers, drilled in the art of war, and led by a young king who understood the battlefield as well as any seasoned general. Within weeks, Charles had mobilised his forces, striking first at Denmark. While the Danes expected Sweden to struggle under the weight of multiple invasions, Charles's response was swift and devastating. Leading an amphibious assault, he landed in Zealand with 10,000 men, catching the Danish forces completely off guard. The speed precision of the Swedish attack forced Frederick IV to sue for peace in a matter of weeks, bringing Denmark's campaign to an abrupt and humiliating end. Charles then turned his attention to the east. Learning of Peter the Great's siege of Narva, the Swedish king marshalled a force of 12,000 men and marched across the icy landscape to confront the vastly superior Russian army. It was a daring move, but Charles thrived on audacity. In late November, the Swedes arrived outside Narva, battered by snow and frost, but ready for battle. The Russians, confident in their overwhelming numbers, underestimated the ferocity of Charles's counterattack. The Battle of Narva was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. Taking advantage of a blizzard that blinded the Russian forces, Charles ordered his troops to charge through the storm, their movements swift and precise. The Swedish lines broke through the Russian defences, causing chaos and panic in the enemy ranks. Within hours, the massive Russian army was in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and captured. It was a stunning victory, one that sent shockwaves across Europe. While Augustus II's invasion of Livonia continued to smoulder, his hopes of swift success were dashed by Charles's relentless pace. The young king had proven himself not just a capable leader, but a battlefield prodigy. Each campaign strengthened his grip on Sweden's empire, pushing back against the alliance that sought to destroy it. The opening salvos of the Great Northern War had demonstrated one undeniable truth. Charles XII was no ordinary monarch. He was a lion among jackals, unyielding and unpredictable. As the smoke cleared from these first battles, the Triple Alliance faced a harsh reality. Sweden would not fall so easily, and their dream of dismantling its empire would require far greater effort and far greater sacrifice. But the war was far from over. Denmark, though temporarily subdued, still harboured ambitions of vengeance. Augustus and Peter, wounded but not defeated, prepared for their next moves. Charles, emboldened by his victories, now set his sights on consolidating his power and taking the fight to his enemies' homelands. The next phase of the conflict loomed on the horizon, beginning with a daring assault on Denmark's capital itself. The siege of Copenhagen was about to begin. In the summer of 1700, the Danish capital of Copenhagen faced a threat unlike any it had seen before. As King Frederick IV prepared his forces to exploit Sweden's perceived vulnerability, he never imagined that his own kingdom would become a battlefield. Charles XII, the youthful king of Sweden, was about to launch a campaign so daring, so swift, that it would leave his enemies reeling. This was no mere show of force. It was a masterstroke of strategy that would change the course of the Great Northern War. Denmark had long been a thorn in Sweden's side. Its ambitions centred on reclaiming lost territories and asserting dominance over the Øresund Strait. With the support of the Triple Alliance, Frederick IV believed he could finally break Sweden's grip on the Baltic. To this end, he targeted Holstein-Gottorp, Sweden's key ally, laying siege to its fortified towns in a bid to sever Sweden's western support. It was a calculated move, but one that underestimated the sheer audacity of Charles XII. The Swedish king's response was nothing short of spectacular. Displaying the kind of boldness that would define his reign, Charles gathered a fleet and an army of 10,000 men, setting his sights directly on the heart of Denmark. The plan was ambitious and fraught with risk. An amphibious assault on Zealand, Denmark's largest island, and the location of its capital, Copenhagen. Such an operation required precision, speed, and unwavering determination. Charles possessed all three in abundance. As Swedish ships approached the Danish coast, a storm of cannon fire greeted them, but Charles pressed forward. His forces landed near Humlebeck, bypassing Danish defences with remarkable speed. The campaign that followed was a textbook display of strategic brilliance. Swedish troops moved with an efficiency that left the Danes scrambling to respond. The speed of the Swedish king's march was as if the gods themselves moved him, one contemporary observer noted. Within days, Charles's army had positioned itself to threaten Copenhagen directly. For Frederick IV, the situation was catastrophic. Danish forces, already stretched thin by their campaign in Holstein-Gottorp, were unable to mount an effective defence. The citizens of Copenhagen, gripped by panic, watched helplessly as the Swedish army advanced. With his capital under siege and his kingdom on the brink of collapse, Frederick had no choice but to seek peace. The resulting Treaty of Travendal, signed in August 1700, was a triumph for Charles XII. Denmark was forced to abandon its campaign against Holstein-Gottorp and withdraw from the Triple Alliance. In a single stroke, Charles had neutralised one of Sweden's most persistent foes and secured his western flank. The treaty not only showcased his military prowess, but also sent a clear message to the rest of Europe. Sweden, under Charles's leadership, was a force to be reckoned with. But the young king's mind was already turning to the east. While Denmark had been subdued, the fires of war still burned in Livonia and Estonia. News had reached Charles of a massive Russian army laying siege to Narva, a fortress of vital importance to Sweden's eastern defences. Victory in Copenhagen was a significant achievement, but the survival of Sweden's empire required decisive action against this new threat. With characteristic resolve, Charles set his sights on Narva, where one of the most dramatic battles of his career awaited. As winter gripped the Baltic in late 1700, a young Swedish king embarked on a journey that would etch his name into the annals of military history. News of Narva's plight had reached Charles XII. Peter the Great's vast Russian army, 35,000 strong, had encircled the fortress, intent on delivering a decisive blow to Sweden's eastern defences. For Charles, there was no question of retreat or delay. He would march his army of 12,000 across frozen lands, defying both the elements and the odds, to face an enemy 3 times his size. This was the crucible in which legends were forged. The march to Narva was grueling, but the discipline and resolve of the Swedish army were unmatched. Hardened by years of rigorous training and imbued with the spirit of their king, the soldiers pressed forward through snow and frost. They were a professional force, their loyalty bound to Charles, who unwavering confidence. Arriving outside Narva on November 20th, the Swedish army found itself in the shadow of Russia's overwhelming numbers. Yet, where others might have hesitated, Charles saw opportunity. His plan was bold, audacious, exactly the kind of strategy that had become his hallmark. The Russian camp stretched for miles, an imposing array of men and artillery. But beneath this display of strength lay vulnerabilities. Peter the Great's army, though massive, was inexperienced, a patchwork of hastily trained recruits. The Tsar himself was absent, having departed just days earlier to secure reinforcements. Command fell to Charles Eugene de Croix, a capable but unfamiliar leader whose authority over the Russian forces was tenuous at best. Charles XII intended to exploit every weakness. On November 30th, a blizzard descended upon the battlefield, shrouding the land in swirling snow. To the Russians, it was a curse, obscuring their vision and sowing confusion in their ranks. To the Swedes, it was a gift. Charles ordered his troops to advance under the storm's cover, their movements swift and precise. As they closed in, the wind shifted, hurling snow directly into the faces of the Russian defenders. The snowstorm blinded them, but the Swedish bayonets were their true undoing, wrote Carl Magnusson, a Swedish officer who witnessed the battle. The Swedish attack was a masterclass in coordination and discipline. Dividing his forces into two columns, Charles launched a pincer movement that overwhelmed the Russian lines. The Swedes' bayonets cut through the confused defenders, breaking their formations and triggering a cascade of panic. Within hours, the mighty Russian army was in disarray, fleeing the field or surrendering en masse. By the day's end, over 10,000 Russians were dead, and thousands more had been taken prisoner. The Swedes, though outnumbered, had triumphed with minimal losses. The victory at Narva was more than a tactical success. It was a psychological earthquake. For Peter the Great, it was a humbling reminder of his army's weaknesses and Sweden's enduring might. Yet, Peter was not a man to be deterred by defeat. The loss spurred him to redouble his efforts to modernize Russia's military. He implemented sweeping reforms, building a professional army modelled on European standards and laying the groundwork for the resurgence that would come in later years. For Charles XII, Narva was a crowning achievement, cementing his reputation as one of Europe's greatest military commanders. The triumph sent shockwaves through the Triple Alliance and bolstered Swedish morale. It also gave Charles a sense of invincibility that would fuel his ambitions in the years to come. While Narva was a victory for the ages, it was not the war's end. To the south, the flames of conflict continued to burn. Livonia, under pressure from Saxony, Poland, was in desperate need of defence. With Denmark subdued and Russia temporarily crippled, Charles turned his gaze toward this embattled province. The campaign in Livonia, spanning 1701 to 1704, would be the next chapter in the saga of Sweden's fight for survival and supremacy. The winds of war swept southward as Charles XII set his sights on Livonia, a province under relentless pressure from Saxony and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For centuries, Livonia and Estonia had served as vital outposts of Swedish power, their ports and fortresses guarding the eastern flank of the Baltic Empire. But now, Augustus II of Saxony-Poland sought to wrest them from Sweden's grasp, using the chaos of the Great Northern War to expand his dominion. Charles, fresh from his victory at Narva, was determined to deny him that prize. Livonia became a proving ground for the Swedish army's discipline and Charles's tactical genius. Throughout 1701, Swedish forces clashed with Saxon troops across rivers, fields, and fortifications. The Battle of Riga that summer demonstrated Sweden's ability to hold its ground against larger, more entrenched armies. Augustus, renowned for his ambition, but lacking Charles's strategic brilliance, struggled to break Swedish defences. The Poles called him Augustus the Strong, but his iron will was no match for the unyielding resolve of the Swedish king. Charles saw Livonia not merely as a battlefield, but as a stepping stone toward dismantling Saxony's power at its source. In a letter to his generals he wrote, "The Polish crown is but a stepping stone to greater victories." With this vision, he set in motion one of the boldest political manoeuvres of his reign, the deposition of Augustus II from the Polish throne. Augustus had worn the crown of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as an elective monarch, his position dependent on the support of Poland's fractious nobility. Charles knew that exploiting these divisions could topple Augustus's reign and neutralise a key adversary. By 1702, the war had expanded into Poland itself. Swedish forces marched deep into enemy territory, defeating Saxon and Polish armies in a series of decisive engagements. The Battle of Klissow was a defining moment, where Charles led his troops to victory against overwhelming odds, cementing his reputation as a master tactician. With Augustus's forces reeling, Charles turned his attention to the political stage. Through a combination of military pressure and deft diplomacy, he persuaded Poland's nobility to abandon Augustus in favour of Stanislaw Leszczyński, a pliant candidate who would serve as a Swedish ally. The installation of Stanislaw as king in 1704 was a masterstroke. It shattered Augustus's influence in the Commonwealth, weakening the Saxon-Polish alliance and giving Sweden a powerful foothold in Eastern Europe. Yet the move was not without its consequences. The Polish-Lithuanian nobility, never known for unity, splintered further. Resistance to Swedish control festered in the countryside, fueled by resentment of foreign interference. Charles's military victories could topple kings, but they could not extinguish the deep-seated divisions that plagued the region. Meanwhile, the wider balance of power in Eastern Europe was shifting. With Augustus humbled and Saxony's military crippled, Sweden had secured a dominant position in the region, but new threats loomed on the horizon. Peter the Great, licking his wounds after Narva, had begun the arduous process of reforming his army and rebuilding Russia's strength. The respite Charles had earned with his campaigns in Livonia would prove temporary as a more formidable Russian force began to emerge. marked the zenith of Charles XII's power. He had demonstrated not only military brilliance, but also a keen understanding of how to leverage politics to his advantage. Yet these victories came at a cost. Sweden's resources were stretched thin, and its enemies were far from vanquished. Even as Charles celebrated his triumphs, Peter the Great was laying the foundation for Russia's resurgence, a transformation that would soon challenge Sweden's supremacy once more. Defeat at Narva could have crushed a lesser ruler, but Peter the Great was not a man to be easily broken. The humiliation at the hands of Charles XII in 1700 did not signal an end to Russia's ambitions. It ignited a transformation. Determined to pull his empire out of its medieval slumber and into the modern world, Peter embarked on a series of sweeping reforms that would reshape Russia's destiny. His vision was vast, his methods ruthless, and his results profound. The Russian military was the first target of Peter's unrelenting drive for modernization. The defeat at Narva had laid bare the weaknesses of his army: poorly trained recruits, outdated tactics, and an over-reliance on raw numbers. Peter would not tolerate such deficiencies. He travelled across Europe, studying the armies of Prussia, the Netherlands, and England, gleaning lessons from the continent's most advanced military powers. Returning home, he reorganised his forces, establishing a professional standing army built on Western principles. He brought in foreign officers to train his soldiers, introduced new weaponry, and implemented rigorous discipline. No detail was too small for Peter's attention. Even the uniforms of his troops reflected his vision of a modernised Russia. But Peter's reforms extended far beyond the battlefield. He understood that a strong military required a robust state to sustain it. To that end, he overhauled Russia's administrative system, centralizing power and streamlining governance. He introduced a table of ranks, a hierarchy that rewarded service to the state over noble birth, and demanded accountability from his officials. Taxes were raised, industries were founded, and foreign experts were invited to help modernize Russia's economy. Iron foundries and shipyards sprang up almost overnight, supplying the materials needed for Peter's grand ambitions. Among his most audacious projects was the creation of St. Petersburg, a city built on the swampy shores of the Neva River. This was no ordinary urban expansion. It was a statement. St. Petersburg is my window, and through it we will face Europe, Peter declared. He envisioned the city as a symbol of Russia's transformation, a gateway to the West and a bastion of modernity. Despite the harsh conditions and staggering loss of life among the labourers, the city rose from the marshes, its elegant architecture reflecting the European styles Peter admired. In 1712, it became Russia's new capital, a physical embodiment of Peter's desire to shift his empire's gaze westward. These reforms came at a cost. Peter's relentless pursuit of modernization often met resistance from his people, who were wary of his radical changes. Old traditions were uprooted, and the boyars, the powerful Russian nobility, saw their influence diminished. Yet pressed on, wielding his authority with an iron fist. For him, the transformation of Russia was not optional, it was a necessity. He believed that only by strengthening his nation could he hope to challenge Sweden and secure Russia's place among Europe's great powers. The fruits of Peter's efforts soon became evident. By 1705, Russia had a rebuilt and modernized military, one capable of standing toe-to-toe with its rivals. The economy, though strained, was better equipped to support prolonged warfare. St. Petersburg stood as a testament to Russia's new identity, a bold declaration that the nation would no longer be a passive observer in European affairs, but an active participant. Peter's reforms were not simply about preparing for the next battle, they were about shaping the future. His efforts laid the foundation for Russia's rise as a dominant force in Eastern Europe, ensuring that his legacy would endure long after his reign. However, the transformation was far from complete, and the war against Sweden was far from over. As Peter's newly reformed army began its march, Russia prepared to launch a counter-offensive that would test Charles XII like never before. The tides of war were shifting, and the Russian bear was ready to strike. The tide of war began to shift in the bitter winters and endless forests of Eastern Europe. After the catastrophic defeat at Narva, Peter the Great had vowed that Russia would never again suffer such humiliation. His modernization efforts were no mere vanity project. They were a lifeline for an empire yearning to assert itself. By 1705, the fruits of his labour began to show. The Russian military, once a patchwork of untrained levies, was now a professional force, armed with modern weapons and bolstered by Peter's iron will. It was time to test this new machine against the might of Charles XII's Sweden. Peter's strategy was as pragmatic as it was brutal. Knowing that he could not yet defeat Charles in open battle, the Tsar adopted a policy of scorched earth, forcing the Swedes to march through desolate lands stripped of supplies. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and the vastness of Russia became a weapon in itself. This strategy slowed the Swedish advance and gave Russia the breathing room it needed to regain its footing. The first signs of Russia's resurgence came in 1705 and 1706. At the Battle of Kmałatów, the Russian army, though not victorious, demonstrated its growing resilience against the Swedes. While Charles XII was occupied with his campaign in Poland, Peter seized the opportunity to consolidate his hold over the Baltic provinces. By 1706, Russian forces had reclaimed key territories, including the strategically vital town of Dorpat. Each victory emboldened Peter and drained Swedish resources, subtly altering the balance of power in the region. But it was the campaigns of 1707 and 1708 that truly revealed the strength of Peter's reformed military. The Battle of Lesnaya in September 1708 became a turning point, earning its place in Russian history as the mother of Russian victories. A Swedish supply column, critical to Charles XII's invasion plans, was intercepted and annihilated instigated by Charles XII, began to crack. Peter's confidence grew with each victory, as did his determination to challenge Sweden's dominance in the Baltic. "The Tsar does not falter. He bends the storm to his will," wrote a contemporary chronicler, capturing the tenacity that defined Peter's leadership during this period. The counter-offensive was not without its costs. Russian soldiers endured grueling marches, harsh winters, and relentless combat. The civilian population bore the brunt of Peter's scorched earth tactics, suffering famine and displacement. Yet Peter remained steadfast, believing that sacrifice was necessary for Russia's transformation into a great power. The Tsar's resolve inspired loyalty among his commanders and fear among his enemies. By the end of 1708, the balance of power in the Baltic had shifted dramatically. Russia had not only regained its footing, but had also proven itself a formidable opponent. Swedish forces, though still fearsome, were increasingly stretched thin, their resources depleted by years of relentless campaigning. Charles XII, ever the audacious tactician, refused to retreat. Instead, he prepared for a bold move, a march into the heart of Russia itself. As winter loomed, Charles's eyes turned toward Moscow. It was a decision that would define the course of the Great Northern War and pit two of Europe's most iconic leaders against one another in a struggle for survival and supremacy. By 1708, Charles XII's reputation as an unstoppable military genius had been forged in the fires of countless victories. Bold, decisive, and unyielding, he had marched through Poland and Saxony, installing puppet kings and dismantling alliances. But now he faced his greatest challenge yet. With Peter the Great's Russia growing stronger and more defiant, Charles resolved to strike at the heart of his adversary's power, Moscow. This audacious gamble, however, would lead him and his army into the jaws of one of history's harshest campaigns. The march began with confidence, as Charles's army, seasoned and disciplined, crossed the Russian border. They carried with them not just weapons, but the unshakable belief that their king's genius would once again triumph. The plan was ambitious: strike deep into Russian territory, defeat Peter's forces in battle, and force a peace on Swedish terms. For Charles, the campaign was not just about victory. It was about cementing Sweden's dominance and his own legacy. Peter the Great, however, had no intention of giving Charles the decisive battle he sought. Instead, the Tsar implemented his scorched earth strategy with ruthless efficiency. Villages were evacuated and burned, crops destroyed, and supplies hidden or taken far beyond the Swedes' reach. Russian forces shadowed the advancing Swedes, engaging in small skirmishes, but refusing a full confrontation. For Charles, it was a maddening game of cat and mouse, one that slowly drained his army's strength. The vastness of Russia itself became an enemy. As the Swedes marched deeper into the frozen wilderness, the logistical challenges mounted. Roads turned to mud in the autumn rains, wagons sank, and horses collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies dwindled, forcing the army to forage in a land already stripped bare by Peter's scorched earth policy. Hunger began to sap the soldiers' morale, and an unrelenting sense of isolation crept into their ranks. Then came the winter of 1708, 1709, a season so brutal that it etched itself into the collective memory of Europe. Temperatures plummeted, rivers froze solid, and the icy winds cut through even the thickest of clothing. Soldiers huddled in makeshift camps, their fires barely able to stave off the cold. Eyewitness accounts tell of frostbite ravaging the ranks, of men collapsing mid-march and never rising again. The Swedish army's spirit froze long before their bodies did, wrote one officer, capturing the despair that gripped the once mighty force. For Charles, retreat was unthinkable. His unyielding nature, so often a source of inspiration, now became a double-edged sword. He pressed onward, driven by the belief that victory was still within reach. But his army, once a finely honed instrument of war, was breaking under the strain. Thousands deserted, and those who remained grew weaker with each passing day. By the time the Swedes reached the outskirts of Ukraine in early 1709, their numbers had been halved. Seeking to regroup and resupply, Charles turned to Ivan Mazepa, a Ukrainian hetman, who had pledged his support against Peter. But Mazepa's promises proved hollow. The supplies Charles so desperately needed were meagre, and his allies were unable to provide the reinforcements he had hoped for. The dream of a triumphant march into Moscow was slipping away, replaced by the grim reality of survival. Even as his forces dwindled, Charles refused to abandon the campaign. Instead, he prepared for one final, decisive confrontation with Peter the Great. The stage was set for the Battle of Poltava, a clash that would determine the fate of the Swedish Empire and reshape the balance of power in Europe. The sun rose over the Ukrainian steppe on July 8th, 1709, illuminating the battlefield where two titanic wills would clash. For nearly a decade, Charles XII of Sweden had carved a path of conquest across northern and eastern Europe, his victories shaping the continent's power dynamics. But now, at Poltava, the young king faced his greatest test. Sweden's army, once the most feared in Europe, was battered, weakened by months of grueling marches, hunger, and the merciless Russian winter. On the other side stood Peter the Great, leading a Russian army reborn from the ashes of earlier defeats, trained, disciplined, and brimming with confidence. It was here, in this pivotal moment, that the course of the Great Northern War would change forever. Charles XII's decision to fight at Poltava was as audacious as it was desperate. His forces, reduced to around 20,000 men, were outnumbered nearly 2-1 by the Russians, whose army boasted improved weaponry, fortified defences, and the morale of a nation on the rise. Despite his precarious position, Charles remained resolute. Suffering from a wound that left him unable to walk, he directed his commanders from a litter, embodying the unyielding spirit that had carried him to this point. The fate of Sweden was decided on this field, historian Robert Massey later wrote, capturing the gravity of the day. The battle began with a bold Swedish aggressive tactics. His troops attacked the Russian redoubts, aiming to breach their defensive lines and strike at the heart of Peter's forces. Initially, the Swedes showed flashes of their former brilliance, capturing some of the forward positions, but the Russian defences, meticulously planned by Peter and his generals, proved formidable. Earthworks and artillery tore through the Swedish ranks, slowing their advance and sapping their momentum. As the day wore on, the tide turned decisively in favour of the Russians. Peter, observing the battle with the calm precision of a leader who had learned from his earlier failures, unleashed a devastating counterattack. Russian infantry, supported by cavalry and artillery, surged forward, driving the exhausted Swedes back. Chaos erupted within the Swedish lines as the disciplined force that had once swept across Europe began to crumble. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of Swedish soldiers, and their once proud banners lay trampled in the dirt. The consequences of Poltava were catastrophic for Sweden. Charles XII, recognising the battle was lost, fled with a small retinue to the south, seeking refuge in Ottoman territory. The remnants of his army, abandoned and outmanoeuvred, surrendered en masse to the Russians. For Peter the Great, it was a crowning achievement, a moment of vindication for years of relentless reform and sacrifice. Russia had not only avenged its earlier humiliations, but had also secured its place as a dominant power in Eastern Europe. For Sweden, the defeat at Poltava marked the beginning of the end of its empire. The loss of so many seasoned soldiers and commanders was a blow from which it would never fully recover. Territories that had once been bastions of Swedish power now faced the inevitability of Russian domination. Yet, for Charles XII, the story was far from over. As he rode into Ottoman territory, he carried with him the hope of forging new alliances and reclaiming the glory that had defined his early reign. In exile, Charles would find himself navigating the treacherous waters of diplomacy and survival, determined to rise again, even as his empire faltered behind him. His journey from the fields of Poltava to the opulent courts of the Ottoman Empire would become one of the most fascinating chapters of his life, a tale of resilience, ambition, and the unrelenting pursuit of a seemingly unattainable dream. When the dust settled on the battlefield of Poltava, Charles XII of Sweden was not among the thousands of Swedish soldiers captured by Peter the Great's victorious army. Wounded and defeated, the young monarch had fled southward, with a small contingent of loyal followers. His destination was the Ottoman Empire, a vast and powerful realm that Charles believed could be persuaded to turn the tide of war in his favour. What followed was one of the most extraordinary chapters of his life, a story of desperation, diplomacy, and dogged resolve. Crossing into Ottoman territory, Charles found refuge in the fortress of Bender, a remote outpost far from the centres of European power. He arrived not as a broken king, but as a man determined to rewrite his fate. Though Sweden reeled from the loss of its army and territories, Charles's mind remained fixed on a singular goal: securing Ottoman support for a renewed campaign against against Russia. The Ottomans, ancient rivals of the Tsardom, seemed a natural ally, yet convincing them to act would prove far more difficult than Charles anticipated. The Ottoman Sultan, Ahmed III, welcomed the Swedish king as an honoured guest, offering him shelter and protection. However, the empire's court was divided on how to handle its unexpected visitor. Some advisers, swayed by Charles's charisma and his pleas for a joint offensive, argued for direct action against Russia. Others, wary of entangling the empire in a prolonged conflict, urged caution. Charles, undeterred, lobbied relentlessly, employing gifts, bribes, and impassioned arguments to win favour. His persistence earned him the nickname the Iron-Head King among Ottoman chroniclers, who marvelled at his unyielding determination. In 1711, Charles's efforts seemed to bear fruit when the Ottomans declared war on Russia. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Pruth, where Peter the Great's forces, caught in a vulnerable position, were surrounded by Ottoman troops. For a moment, it seemed as though Charles's dream of toppling Russia might become a reality, but the Ottomans, despite their advantage, opted for negotiation rather than annihilation. Peter secured his army's retreat by offering territorial concessions and agreeing to dismantle Russian fortifications near the Ottoman border. For Charles, the outcome of the Pruth campaign was a bitter disappointment. The Ottomans' reluctance to press their advantage revealed the limits of his influence as an exile. While he remained a guest of the empire, his position grew increasingly precarious. Ottoman patience with their royal refugee began to wear thin, especially as Charles's demands for further military action escalated. By 1713, tensions reached a boiling point, culminating in a bizarre and chaotic episode known as the Kalabalik at Bender, in which Ottoman forces attempted to detain the Swedish king, who resisted with characteristic defiance. Charles's time in exile was marked not only by his political struggles, but also by his isolation from Sweden. While the king schemed and strategized in the Ottoman Empire, his homeland faced mounting challenges. Sweden's government, strained by the war and lacking its monarch's leadership, struggled to maintain stability. Territories were lost, alliances faltered, and enemies closed in. For Charles, the distance from his kingdom was a wound deeper than any inflicted on the battlefield. By 1714, Charles had exhausted his welcome in the Ottoman Empire. Realizing that further appeals for aid would be fruitless, he made the extraordinary decision to return to Sweden, not by ship or carriage, but by an overland journey that took him through hostile territories. His return was as audacious as any of his military campaigns, a testament to his indomitable spirit. Yet, the Sweden to which Charles returned was not the empire he had left. The Baltic, once dominated by Swedish ships, was now a theatre of conflict, where rival powers jockeyed for supremacy. Charles, ever the warrior king, would soon find himself embroiled in the struggle, determined to reclaim his nation's place on the world stage. As he turned his attention to the Baltic, he knew the battles ahead would define not only Sweden's future, but his own legacy. By 1715, the tides of the Baltic Sea supremacy. The empire that had once dominated the northern waters, its ships patrolling every crucial strait and its armies fortifying every strategic coast, was now battered and besieged. The Great Northern War had turned against Sweden, and its rivals, sensing weakness, closed in to claim the spoils. For Charles XII, newly returned from years of exile, the challenge was monumental. Yet, true to his nature, the warrior king refused to relent. Denmark, long humiliated by Sweden's victories in the 17th century, was among the first to pounce. King Frederick IV sought not just to reclaim lost territories, but to erase the memory of Sweden's dominance over the Øresund Strait. Danish forces, supported by Russia and Prussia, launched campaigns to wrest control of Sweden's holdings along the Baltic coastline. Meanwhile, Russia's navy, the brainchild of Peter the Great's relentless modernization efforts, emerged as a formidable force. Once a landlocked Tsardom, Russia had transformed into a maritime power, its fleets cutting through the Baltic and challenging Sweden's naval supremacy. For Sweden, the situation was dire. Livonia, once a jewel of Swedish influence, fell to Russian forces after relentless campaigns. Estonia too slipped from Sweden's grasp, its fortresses overwhelmed and its defenders outmatched. With each loss, the Baltic grew less Swedish and more Russian. As historian Robert Frost observed, the Baltic became a Russian lake, a body of water dominated not by Stockholm, but by the growing might of St. Petersburg. Charles XII faced these setbacks with characteristic determination, but even his boundless energy could not turn back the clock. The Swedish navy, stretched thin and outgunned, struggled to maintain a presence in the Baltic. On land, Sweden's armies, drained of manpower and resources, fought valiantly but could not match the combined strength of their enemies. The strain on Sweden's economy was crippling. War taxes soared, trade collapsed, and famine spread across the kingdom, further weakening its ability to sustain the fight. Yet Charles persisted. He launched daring raids and surprise offensives, attempting to outmaneuver his foes and regain lost ground. In 1716, he crossed the frozen Kattegat Strait to invade Norway, a bold move aimed at pressuring Denmark and securing a bargaining chip for future negotiations. The campaign was audacious, but ultimately inconclusive, as harsh weather and logistical challenges forced a retreat. It was a microcosm of Sweden's struggles, flashes of brilliance overshadowed by insurmountable odds. As Russia's dominance in the Baltic solidified, Peter the Great turned his ambitions towards consolidating his empire's newfound power. St. Petersburg, built on the swampy banks of the Neva River, now stood as a glittering testament to Russia's ascendance. Meanwhile, Charles XII refused to abandon his vision of a resurgent Sweden. He poured every ounce of his strength into the fight, even as his kingdom faltered under the weight of war. By 1718, Charles's resolve remained unbroken, but his options were dwindling. Sweden's empire had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Its once mighty fleets and armies diminished. For Charles, There was only one path forward, a final desperate campaign to reclaim his nation's honour and territory. His gaze turned once more toward Norway, where he would make his last stand on the battlefield that would seal his fate. Charles XII returned to Sweden in 1715 as a king transformed by exile, defeat, and desperation. His empire was crumbling under the relentless pressure of enemies on all sides, and his people, weary from decades of war, yearned for peace. But Charles was no ordinary monarch. For him, peace without honour was unthinkable. Despite the long odds, he was determined to reclaim Sweden's lost glory, restore its military might, and strike fear once more into the hearts of his enemies. The final act of Charles's storied life began with an audacious plan: an invasion of Norway, a Danish-Norwegian stronghold. His reasoning was bold, if not entirely pragmatic. Norway's strategic position made it a tempting target, and Charles believed that capturing key territories there would give him leverage against Denmark and strengthen Sweden's faltering position in the Baltic. It was a risky gambit, but Charles thrived on risk, and his indomitable will drove him forward. In the autumn of 1718, Charles launched his campaign. The focus of his efforts was the fortress of Fredrikstad, a well-defended outpost in southeastern Norway. The siege of Fredrikstad was as grueling as it was symbolic. A battle, not just for territory, but for the survival of Sweden's imperial ambitions. Under Charles's personal leadership, Swedish forces dug trenches, hauled artillery through freezing rain, and prepared for a protracted fight. Despite the deteriorating conditions and mounting casualties, Charles remained at the front, inspiring his men with his presence and resolve. But the campaign was plagued by challenges. Swedish resources were stretched to the breaking point, and morale among the troops wavered. Resistance from within Charles's own court compounded the difficulties. Some of his advisers, exhausted by years of war, questioned the wisdom of the Norwegian campaign. Others, fearing the consequences of failure, urged the king to reconsider. Charles dismissed their doubts with characteristic defiance, pressing forward even as winter tightened its grip. On the night of November 30th, 1718, tragedy struck. While inspecting the siege lines at Fredrikstad, Charles was struck by a bullet to the head, killing him instantly. The source of the shot remains a mystery to this day, with theories ranging from an enemy sniper to an assassination by disillusioned members of his own army. What is certain is that the death of Charles XII marked the end of an era. As one chronicler lamented, with his death, the Lion of the North was no more. The reactions to Charles's death were as varied as his reputation. For his enemies, it was a moment of relief and triumph, signalling the collapse of Sweden's ability to resist. For his allies, it was a devastating blow, leaving Sweden without its charismatic leader in its darkest hour. At home, the news was met with a mixture of sorrow and exhaustion. The king's relentless drive had inspired admiration, but it had also drained the nation of its resources, its manpower, and its spirit. Charles XII's death left Sweden at a crossroads. As Sweden prepared to conclude the Great Northern War, the stage was set for the Treaty of Nystad, a settlement that would finally bring an end to the conflict and reshape the map of Europe. The Lion of the North had fallen, but his shadow lingered over the Baltic, a reminder of the heights to which Sweden had once soared and the depths to which it had been brought. In the quiet Finnish town of Nystad on August 30th, 1721, the Great Northern War reached its solemn conclusion. The Treaty of Nystad, a carefully negotiated agreement, brought an end to 2 decades of bloodshed, shifting the balance of power in Europe and redrawing the map of the Baltic region. For Sweden, it marked the twilight of an empire that had once dominated northern Europe. For Russia, it heralded the dawn of a new era as a major European power. The terms of the treaty reflected the reality of Sweden's weakened position. Exhausted by years of war, its armies shattered and its resources depleted, Sweden had little choice but to cede significant territories to its triumphant rival. Livonia, Estonia and Ingria, all jewels in Sweden's Baltic crown, were formally handed over to Russia. Finland, which had been occupied by Russian forces during the war, was returned to Sweden, but the gesture did little to mitigate the profound losses. The treaty also required Sweden to recognise Russia's sovereignty over the Baltic islands of Osil and Dago, further solidifying Peter the Great's hold on the region. For Russia, the Treaty of Nystad was the culmination of Peter the Great's lifelong ambition. The acquisition of these territories transformed the Tsardom into a maritime power with access to vital trade routes and ports. St. Petersburg, the city Peter had carved out of the swamps, now stood as a gleaming symbol of Russia's emergence as a modern state. The treaty confirmed what the battlefield had already proven. Russia was now a dominant force in northern Europe, capable of shaping the continent's future. The implications of the treaty extended far beyond the Baltic. Sweden, once feared as a warrior nation, was now reduced to a secondary power. The kingdom retained its independence and some of its former territories, but the loss of its Baltic strongholds signalled the end of its imperial ambitions. In the words of a contemporary diplomat, the Swedish crown has faded and the Russian star ascends. No longer the hegemon of the north, Sweden began the slow process of rebuilding, focusing inward and adopting a more neutral role in European affairs. The Treaty of Nystad also marked a turning point in European geopolitics. The decline of Sweden created a vacuum that allowed other powers, Russia, Prussia and later Austria, to vie for dominance in the region. Meanwhile, Britain and France watched closely as the balance of power shifted, recognizing that Russia's ascendance would reshape the dynamics of continental politics. Peter the Great's vision of Russia as a European power had been realized, and the Treaty of Nystad was its official seal. For those who had lived through the Great Northern War, the treaty was both an end and a beginning. It ended the dream of Swedish supremacy, but began a new chapter of Russian influence. It closed the book on 2 decades of suffering, but opened a new era of political rivalries that would shape the centuries to come. The consequences of the Treaty of Nystad reverberated far beyond changed the face of the continent, and its aftershocks would continue to be felt in politics, trade, and the very fabric of international relations. As the ink dried on the treaty, the world prepared to grapple with the long-term consequences of the Great Northern War. The Great Northern War, spanning 2 decades, was not merely a clash of armies, but a battle for the future of Europe. Its aftermath rippled across the continent, altering the balance of power, reshaping borders, and leaving an indelible mark on the strategies of nations. The war's outcome was more than a military defeat for Sweden. It was a tectonic shift that brought an end to one era and heralded the beginning of another. The most profound consequence of the conflict was Russia's emergence as a great European power. Under Peter the Great, the once isolated Tsardom had been transformed into a modern state with a powerful military, a burgeoning navy, and a commanding presence in the Baltic. The territories acquired in the Treaty of Nystad solidified Russia's control over key trade routes, making the Baltic Sea a lifeline for its growing economy. St. Petersburg, Peter's carefully crafted window to Europe, became a vibrant hub of commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Russia's rise marked the dawn of a new era in Eastern Europe, one where the Tsars could shape the destiny of the continent. Sweden, by contrast, saw its star fade. Once the dominant force in Northern Europe, Sweden's defeat signalled the end of its imperial ambitions. Though it remained a sovereign kingdom, its focus turned inward, shifting from expansion to survival. The loss of Livonia, Estonia, and other key territories reduced Sweden's influence in the Baltic, forcing it to adopt a more defensive posture in its foreign policy. What had been an empire of war now became a nation seeking peace. Beyond the immediate shift in power dynamics, the Great Northern War had broader implications for statecraft and military strategy. The war exposed the limitations of relying solely on aggressive expansion and highlighted the importance of modernization in sustaining a nation's strength. Peter's reforms in Russia, his emphasis on professional armies, naval power, and centralized governance, became a model that other European nations sought to emulate. The lessons of the war also influenced military tactics, with the conflict's campaigns providing a study in adaptability, logistics, and the devastating potential of scorched earth strategies. The Baltic itself, once a battleground for Swedish dominance, became a stage for new rivalries. Control of its waters and ports was no longer the sole purview of Sweden. It became a contested region vital to the ambitions of Russia, Denmark, and Prussia. The war underscored the strategic importance of the Baltic as a gateway for trade and military power, a fact that would shape European conflicts for centuries. Culturally, the Great Northern War reshaped the identity of its key players. For Russia, it was a coming-of-age moment, a declaration that it was no longer the backward kingdom of old, but a modern empire capable of competing with Europe's finest. For Sweden, the war became a sombre chapter in its history, a reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the cost of overreach. Across Europe, the war's impact was felt not only in politics, but in the collective psyche of nations grappling with the shifting tides of history. As historian Robert Frost so aptly put it, the Great Northern War reshaped not just the map, but the soul of Europe. The conflict's legacy extended far beyond its immediate consequences, influencing the course of diplomacy, warfare, and governance in ways that resonated for generations. It was a war that defined the ambitions of Tsars and kings, reshaped the Baltic's future, and laid the groundwork for the modern European state system. Yet, the story of the Great Northern War is incomplete without reflecting on its human cost and the resilience of those who lived through it. From the frozen plains of Narva to the blood-soaked fields of Poltava, the war tested the limits of endurance, ambition, and vision. Its lessons of triumph and tragedy, of overreach and innovation, remain etched in history. As the conflict's final chapter closed, a new era dawned, leaving behind a reshaped Europe and a wealth of lessons for the generations that followed. It is here, in the echoes of its consequences, that we find the conclusion of the Great Northern War's epic tale. The Great Northern War was more than a contest of armies. It was a crucible in which the ambitions of empires were tested, reshaped, and for some, destroyed. It was a clash of visions, a phrase aptly captured by historian Robert Massey, and a stark reminder of the forces that drive history: the hunger for power, the resilience of nations, and the inevitability of change. For over 2 decades, the war pitted Charles XII's unyielding determination against Peter the Great's transformative ambition, leaving an indelible mark on Europe. The war's trajectory was as dramatic as it was instructive. It began with Sweden's dominance, a kingdom whose military prowess had made it the envy and terror of its neighbours. Under Charles XII, the Lion of the North, Sweden defied odds and defeated coalition after coalition. From Narva's frosty triumph to the relentless campaigns in Poland and Livonia, Sweden seemed unstoppable. But even lions falter when faced with storms they cannot control. Peter the Great's Russia, battered but not broken, used the lessons of defeat as a catalyst for reinvention. Through modernisation, strategic cunning, and an unwavering vision of a Europeanised Russia, Peter turned his fledgling empire into a powerhouse capable of defeating even the mightiest of foes. The Battle of Poltava was more than just a turning point. It was a stark declaration that the old order was crumbling and a new force had risen in the east. The Treaty of Nystad solidified the war's outcomes. Russia emerged as a great power, its star ascending in the European constellation, while Sweden's influence waned. Yet the legacy of the Great Northern War extends far beyond territorial exchanges. It reshaped the balance of power in Europe, elevated the strategic importance of the Baltic, and introduced a new era of diplomacy and military innovation. The conflict's echoes reverberate through history, offering timeless lessons for leaders and nations alike. Modern audiences can draw much from the triumphs and tragedies of war's central figures. Charles XII's audacity and resilience remain a testament to the power of unwavering determination, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Yet, his story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreach, where ambition blinds even the boldest to the limits of their strength. Peter the Great, in contrast, exemplifies adaptability and vision, showing how a leader's ability to embrace change can transform not only their nation, but the course of history itself. Ultimately, the Great Northern War reminds us that history is never static. The tides of power shift, often dramatically, and the decisions of individuals can ripple across centuries. As Massey aptly said, this was not just a conflict of arms, but a clash of visions, a phrase that encapsulates both its stakes and its legacy. If this journey through one of history's most pivotal wars has intrigued you, consider joining us for more explorations of the past. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so we can continue uncovering the stories, lessons, and wonders of history together. The past may be behind us, but its lessons continue to shape our world, and together we'll ensure its stories are never forgotten. I hope wherever you are in the world you are safe and relaxed and, as always, sleep well.